All right, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is 6 o'clock, so we will get this meeting kicked off. This isn't interactive online, but we will be posting a video of this on our YouTube channel. And we will give you the ability to submit your feedback on the topics that we discussed tonight via email. So those of you listening to this later, we still value your input. So just a little background on what is going on here. First of all, I'm Chris Truitt. I'm the village manager. Myself, our Public Works Director, Juan Penna, and our Mayor, Jonathan Groth, make up the steering committee on behalf of Biscayne Park. So what we're doing with this vulnerability assessment is essentially we're through a grant, we were able to bring in Kimley Horn. They're going to do an overall vulnerability assessment, taking a look at which parts of Biscayne Park are subject to risks such as flooding, given different weather scenarios. So this meeting tonight is an opportunity for you, the public, to share some of your concerns and some of your observations, as well as to give you just kind of an introduction into the overall process of the vulnerability assessment and what's going to happen. So the end result from all of this, once we're completely done with the process, is understanding where we have significant issues, as well as actionable items that we can take to try to mitigate some of those issues. And it's because of this vulnerability assessment and those action items that we will hopefully be eligible for additional grants to fund some of the development of these solutions. So this is going to be kind of a long process. This isn't something we'll be able to get finished up in the next month or two, for example. But at the end of it, like I said, we'll be in a much better position. We will know what action to take, and we'll have the documentation that many of the grantors need to be able to give us those funds to handle that. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Alejandro. He is our representative here from Kimley Horn, and he's going to be leading our meeting tonight.
Thank you, Chris. Again, my name is Alejandro. I'm with Kimley Horn, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about the vulnerability assessment that we're putting together in partnership with the Village of Biscayne Park. And with that, we'll go ahead and get right into it. So as an introduction, and Chris had already outlined this, is that this project is grant funded in collaboration with FDEP under the Florida Resilient Grant Program. This is essentially the first step in being able to build a resilient community that takes a look at the flooding impacts from different types of flooding scenarios. And this will essentially help identify focus areas that are going to essentially roll out different projects that are going to help the village be more resilient. So what are the project objectives? Obviously, to develop a vulnerability assessment which identifies risk due to sea level rise, storm surge, and rainfall-induced flooding. How do we do this? We analyze data, the available data, to be able to determine what flood depths are occurring throughout the village, what is the severity of flood, and ultimately develop risk levels for each of those individual scenarios, and then develop focus areas to be able to hone in on where exactly we need to focus the projects as well as the funding for the implementation of flood risk. So a summary of the project itself, it's broken down into these 5 different parts. Initially, we start off with the data collection process, the review and data gap analysis. We'll collect information from Miami-Dade County, as well as the village and you all as well, to be able to develop that into an exposure analysis. And I'll go into a little bit more depth on the following slides on each one of these tasks. And then into the sensitivity analysis, followed by the identification of focus areas, where we grab all the information from the sensitivity and exposure analysis to, again, hone in on what areas we need to develop projects for and focus our funding. And then finally, the final vulnerability assessment will take everything all together and merge it into one report that we send off to FDEP. And once we get their approval, it gets published and it's a public record. So the data collection process, the data collection and gap analysis is where we collect information not only from the city, but the village, but also from public resources, and that is with respect to what critical assets are owned and maintained by the village. Those usually fall into 4 different categories. They are the transportation and evacuation routes, the critical infrastructure, the critical community and emergency facilities, as well as the natural, cultural, and historical assets. This information usually is used and developed into GIS layers that we could overlay the flood scenarios and ultimately determine, okay, which of these assets are most at risk based on the different scenarios, flood scenarios that we're running. Additional information that we do grab as well is the topographic data, which establishes the elevations throughout the village based on LiDAR information, and then ultimately the different flood scenarios, which is how much is it going to rain? What could we expect from sea level rise, not only in the near future, but also distant future, as well as the storm surge. This information is generally collected from sources such as NOAA, the Southeast Florida Climate Compact, and other sources, like local sources as well. So the exposure analysis is the next step. This is where we get all the data that we have collected, the different scenarios, and basically put it into a model and essentially develop these flood maps that tell us the extent of flooding and the depth of flooding. We go into basically looking at what sea level rise does, what storm surge. We look at these basically independently and also in conjunction with each other. Basically mix matching to be able to see, okay, what is a rainfall event today look like? What does the rainfall event look like in 2040 based on sea level rise, or 2070 based on sea level rise? So we'll develop different scenarios that essentially will overlay with the critical assets to be able to determine, okay, these critical assets are at risk, and there's this amount of flooding in those areas. So we'll develop the exposure analysis, and with that, we'll move on to the next one, which is the sensitivity analysis. In the sensitivity analysis, we will essentially look at all the different critical assets and basically develop a critical elevation for each one of those assets, and then use the information that we had in the exposure analysis to determine, okay, how much level of flooding or how much at risk is each one of these assets. We'll look at not only in this case major roads, but also critical assets such as this log cabin, police departments, fire departments. So this is just mainly looking at the assets that are owned and maintained by the municipality, and essentially what allows them to function for implementation of these projects. So what you'll see again in this chart is that we'll have the critical assets on the rows, we'll develop the critical elevations, and then we'll also list out all the scenarios that we're analyzing. So starting from left to right, we'll analyze the rainfall scenarios, which are the 100-year and the 500-year storm, and then moving on into the sea level rise events, and then the current storm surge event, and then thereafter is when we start mixing and matching the sea level rise events with the storm surge as well as the 100-year events. So those are called our compounding events. Then we develop a risk level based on the amount of inundation that we're seeing compared to the critical elevation. And then finally, we get into the development of our focus areas, which is going to be the main point of today's conversation. And we would like to ultimately get some feedback from residents as to what they're seeing, because not only are we taking the information from the sensitivity and the exposure analysis, but it's important that we also get feedback from residents to be able to pinpoint exactly where flooding is occurring, not only to also include in as part of the focus areas, but also to be able to verify a lot of the models that we're putting together and the flood depths that we're seeing in the models. So with your input, the input of the village, as well as the supporting information from the models and the data collection, we will go ahead and start identifying these focus areas, just like we're showing here in this example that we did for the city of North Miami Beach. These focus areas will help us do two things. It'll help the village identify areas where they need to focus their projects and funding, as well as request funds from FDEP or state grant funding to be able to get those implementation projects. One more thing is I do have stickers in the back that I will ask you at the end of this presentation to go ahead and start putting them on the boards. That way we could take that feedback from you all. And if there's anyone that wasn't able to attend that is watching this recording, they could also send an email to the village manager, which I'll have the email posted at the end of this presentation, to be able to give us feedback that we could include as part of this study and the final vulnerability assessment to be able to be fully compliant with the standard practice of this vulnerability assessment. So once we get the exposure, the data collection, the exposure analysis, and the sensitivity analysis all wrapped up, we'll develop the focus areas, which is now the task that we're mostly working on right now. We'll develop the focus areas and put it all together into a final vulnerability assessment that will be submitted to FDEP for approval. And once it approval, it becomes a public document. And then along with that, we will also be providing a GIS package to the village that they could maintain for future asset acquiring and ultimately use the flood maps for their purposes of those implementation projects. So something else that we did also provide in the back is a comment card, and this is part of the presentation where we would really like to get your feedback as to where you guys are seeing the flooding, what is the extent of the flooding, what could the village be doing better to, or what the village can be doing to focus their efforts on the flooding impacts that you guys are seeing. One thing is for us to develop a study based on models, but I think it's also important to also get feedback from the residents, what is actually happening on the ground. With that, we could also incorporate it into our identification of focus areas, as well as into our final vulnerability assessment, which will make it a whole. And with that, I'll go ahead and leave you guys with the comment cards as well as the stickers to go ahead and place. Are there any comments or questions that I could address right now? Yeah, go ahead. We're using the most latest available LiDAR data set, which is the 2021. Definitely. Yeah, so we don't really look at the ecological portion of this. This is strictly the LiDAR information that we use is mostly to establish the topographic grades. Essentially, how much storage is being provided within the town? What are the low areas? What are those ridges that you talk about? Essentially, that goes into the modeling process. And if you look at the flood maps that we will develop at some point and in the future public outreach meeting, we'll have those maps developed. You'll be able to see exactly where those ridges lie and essentially where you are in relation to those topographic grades. So in general, we're not really looking at it from an ecological perspective. We're looking at it based on, okay, what are the grades that are established throughout the town based on LiDAR information, and then running a series of storms and tidal events or storm surge events, and how is the village reacting to that? Yeah, we definitely use historical flood data. Yeah. That's how the precipitation depth, so the rainfall induced flooding, the precipitation depths that we get from NOAA is based on a statistical analysis of historical rain gauge data.
There was another flood study done, I don't know, maybe 2016, 17, something like that.
Okay.
Went through a very similar process. They identified a bunch of streets which they said were prone to flooding, which if you ask the people who live here, were not the streets that are prone to flooding. The same. And now you're asking for little dots and stuff. I say all this to ask, what kind of validation will there be with all of this, besides us putting little dots and stuff? Will we be actually looking at where the storm drains are and where they get plugged up, which, by the way, nothing against you, but we have all these new storm drains we put in. We don't even clean the old one. I don't even know if we know where all the storm drains are. Is that part of it? I know I'm not throwing a lot at you.
No, that's okay. And that's a very
frustration And nothing, Chris just got here, this is not aimed at him, we've been doing this, I've been yelling about getting drains and cleaning the drains since we lived here, we live on the street. They put in some new drains, including on our street, but they don't do cleaning.
Gotcha.
Are those programmed in, the current drains, will they be programmed in where those drains are?
That's a very valid question. Now, this vulnerability assessment doesn't go into that amount of depth. This is a worst case scenario. Really, what we're only analyzing is the storage capacity of the village. We don't take into account any of the drainage facilities that, for example, like exfiltration trench or pump stations, those aren't accounted for here. So this is a worst case scenario. And what we do is we look at the sensitivity analysis to see, okay, where is there flooding across the board for all these scenarios to be able to hone in on those focus areas where improvements might be required. The crucial part here is to get input from residents to be able to validate what we're seeing in the model. So this is a very high level study that we're doing. What you're talking about is probably more on a stormwater master planning level, which is more detailed, and it takes into account the exfiltration trench and the storm drains that you existingly have. Does that answer your question?
It does, I just, given that, I don't know what does this really get us?
This,
Other than we're having another study and we
Yeah.
have things to do to study and all that, but selfishly, what does this get the village? We have access to funds to fix some of these things that in worst case scenario, that's what you're telling me, this is like a worst case scenario kind of thing?
correct. So what this gets you is future grant funding. This is the first step. In order to get future grant funding, you need to have a vulnerability assessment in place to be able to request those funds, which will help you in those implementation projects.
So the last one we did said we need $200 million to get everything the way it should be.
So yeah, this is probably a step in the right direction. This will be the first step and to be able to identify those focus areas, right? We don't have the projects. We won't be as detailed as telling you, okay, we need exfiltration trench here, we need a pump station here. But what we'll do is we'll identify those hotspots for you and be able to roll that into these focus areas where we could implement those projects, right? This is a planning level study, essentially. Mike? Yeah.
In addition to the models that you'll use and asking us to identify places. At some point, will someone come here when it's pouring rain, drive around and see for yourself where the flooding is? And as you can see, half the room here tonight is either staff or elected officials on one here. There's very few residents here to report. Now, we're residents as well. Elected officials overall.
Gotcha.
But you don't have someone in this room right now from every place that floods. That's for certain.
Yeah.
So, do you guys come here with your rain slickers and boots on when it's pouring rain and driving? We're only 3/4 of a square mile. We're that big right there. You can walk across the building.
Understood.
Do you come here and say, oh, it's running here and over there and over there?
No, that wouldn't be feasible, to be honest. Not from our perspective and our scope of work. Usually we'll rely on the city officials as well as residents to provide that feedback. For us to be able to, identify a storm event and then come out here and measure it, that's more on a smaller scale level than what we're doing here. This is on a larger scale, larger planning level.
What you're getting from residents is anecdotal at best. You can't trust what we're telling you exactly. We might be wrong, we might be right, we might be exaggerating, we might be way reporting. Here, but if someone comes out here, or you require the city to provide that to you from an actual legitimate source, verified source, I would think that sounds like more useful information than having on a small handful of the top one. No offense to your thoughts on it.
No, understood. Yeah, you guys want, somebody to come out here and, again, this is a very high level planning project. It relies on the information that we do have from NOAA, the Southeast Florida Climate Compact, and those are very reputable sources that we're using to be able to develop these models. Now, as far as verification, it's most feasible for us to be able to just tap into the resources that we do have with the funding that we have. So to your effect, I think, it's mostly relying on the resources that we do have to be able to gauge flood depths would take, a prolonged period of time. That is not something that we could do within a year. For example, a 100-year storm, there's about a 1% chance in a year that's going to happen. So, we may or may not get that flooding that we're looking for and want to gauge.
Yeah, over the last, few years.
Definitely. Mhm. Well, this project doesn't take into account any percolation. It's just mainly the amount of storage that's available within the village, right? Those lower elevations are going to show a lot more flooding, while the higher elevations that land on a ridge are going to have less flooding. So really what we're trying to look at is exactly where are those low elevations? Where do we need to focus those projects to be able to improve the percolation either by creating more green space or maybe some more retention? Those are all part of the implementation projects. They're a little bit out of scope for this project. This is mostly to identify those hotspots and essentially, move forward with a plan to develop those implementation projects after this planning document has been developed.
So, I have a question. Obviously, we're relying. That's.
Well, I wouldn't say heavily relying, because we're building the models and we're trying to verify what we're seeing in the models based on resident input as well as input from city staff. Of course, of course.
What's the plan? Get that, 'cause obviously you're not getting that. So,
Mm.
is there a plan in place to try to get residents? With,
Mm.
or that's residents. On, like, what's the plan?
Definitely. Well, we have another public outreach meeting, and we kind of rely mostly on the city and the village to be able to do the public outreach with respect to social media. But what we can provide is a email for everybody to be able to, whoever's watching this video, to be able to submit their, comments or questions or concerns that we could also take a look at and implement into the study itself.
To speak more directly to your question, Commissioner, once we finalize the recording and get that up, we will have a social media as well as email and new app outreach, inviting people to submit or answer the same questions that are on the comment cards, as well as identify specific locations, on the map where flooding occurs. So that's going to take place, excuse me, over the next several weeks to several months until the next public outreach meeting.
Jim?
As a resident, put in.
Well, it'd be good to understand where you're seeing that flooding, how much flooding. Okay, so what I would ask you is to go ahead and outline or put a dot on your property, and then in the comment cards, go ahead and try to answer these questions to the best of your abilities. And if you have, maybe pictures that you could provide, that is also good stuff that we could use into verifying the information that we already have.
Mr. Manager's point, foreseeable cutoff date or date by which you no longer be accepting feedback. So if there's an email address to which residents can phone in or, write in an address or just say something, hey, I'm seeing flooding on this area, so you can check it against, is there a date by which that you foresee no longer accepting that feedback?
We would like to have everybody's feedback by June, July, just because in September is the cutoff date for the vulnerability assessment where we need to submit to FDP and get it approved. So I would say if we could get feedback by June or July, that would be really helpful to developing the final.
Not put any more strain on your assessment, but further out we could make that, the better, because those are the rainy months, so you're gonna start seeing a lot more flooding here, so the larger sample sizes we have, the better.
Understood.
So if there's a date by which we can have it or, advertise it to everyone receiving it. If it could be in July, then much better than June, but,
Definitely.
within reason.
Of course. Yeah,
So we
definitely.
think it's July 31. Okay, you said June and July, that's a big span.
Well, I mean, we could probably spend it to July, but ultimately, like, again, we have to submit and get final approval from FDEP by September. That'll give us enough time to incorporate those comments or anything you guys are seeing on the ground into the vulnerability assessment.
June, July.
Okay, yeah, we'll work with the city manager to develop that date, or get that date. Mm. Mhm. No, it's not resident driven. We're not relying on the resident input to develop the models. The information that we're developing is based on hard data that we're getting, again, from NOAA, the Southeast Florida Climate Compact. These are hard numbers that we're inputting into the model. The feedback that we get from residents is an added plus to the vulnerability assessment that we're doing. It helps us validate what we're seeing in these models. So we're not simply getting your feedback and developing these floodplain maps based on input because somebody said that there was a foot of inundation in front of their house. So, I think the resident feedback is very important. It helps us make this vulnerability assessment whole. It's an add-on to what we're already seeing in these models. Yes. We haven't decided on a date yet. We have to finish developing the focus areas, but I would expect that to be in the next 2 months.
But it's another one just like this, it's not the second part, it's another opportunity for people to come in.
Correct, correct.
Do you provide any kind of, sort of like, here's what we suggest, how do we promote this to get people to structure or cancel one meeting?
Mhm.
There hasn't been a lot of.
Yeah.
Do you have something that you suggest municipalities, guys, roll it out this way, as many or email blasts, social posts, median signs? Do you have a system that you have seen works for municipalities?
We do have a public outreach team, but again, we mostly rely on village staff to be able to get these organized, get the word out.
Or at
We,
least to kind of give that line.
yeah.
I don't mean to do the work, help us figure out.
No, yeah, definitely, definitely. And we'll work with village staff for the next public outreach meeting to kind of set the tone for what is going to be presented and what people can expect, and hopefully get a broader audience to be able to give us more input.
The main two things kind of you're looking at.
Storm surge, correct. Correct. Yeah, and the combination, looking at future storm surge events, those are called the compounding events. Where essentially we'll look at the planning horizons, in this case, it's the 2040 and the 2070 planning horizon. And we'll look at, okay, what does storm surge look in 2040 versus 2070, as well as rainfall in those events?
Yeah, so just to give you an example, like where I live now, and in the 9 years that I've lived here, I've never had a leak,
Mhm.
except when we had that little storm that came.
Mhm.
And I came to learn real quick that they opened I thought they closed the floodgates, they opened the floodgates.
You had it.
Allow the pressure from that side to keep the pressure pulled in. And that's the only time I've seen flood.
Mhm.
That was not even. So our entire backyard. See what how hard it is. I got where else.
Gotcha. And that's one of our critical assets is your non-existent seawall. We're looking at the elevations along that canal bank to see where we're seeing exceedance of those critical elevations to the point where those assets are being, are at risk essentially, or high risk. Go ahead. Yeah. Definitely, definitely. We look at the floodgate information to understand what are the headwater and tailwater elevations during, I mean, a long span. I can't remember exactly, but we are looking at floodgate data to see exactly what the elevations are, what those critical elevations are for the headwater and tailwater. Any other questions? They're right there in the corner. So go ahead and I'll go ahead and leave you guys with these questions that you could fill out in the comment cards, and we'll go ahead and collect them at the end. And feel free to go ahead and put your dots where you guys have been seeing some of that flooding. Mm-hmm. We'll definitely.
Do the different color dots mean different?
No, no, not at all. Not at all. Just go ahead and place your dot and we'll go ahead and. Everybody has a dot.
From my house,
Okay,
because the road, Sixth Avenue has been surfaced twice since I moved there.
okay.
And all the water that flows from the north,
Thank you.
it kind of goes and drains into my house.
Gotcha. What I'm gonna ask you to do is I'm gonna have an email at the end of this where you could submit all your photos as well as your comment card.
Okay,
You know, consider all these questions
Okay.
into the comment card. That way we can evaluate it and include it as part of our study. But if you wanna go ahead and show me those photos as well, just so I see the severity of flooding that you're.
sorry, I'm at home.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
I am, so I have a white students here and the house is way at the.
Gotcha. Oh, wow.
Don't take
That
my
does
dad.
come through properly.
There's more. There's plenty more.
Gotcha.
Yeah, God.
Was it a prolonged storm? I know we had a pretty big storm over the weekend. How did your?
Every,
You start getting some brackish.
like.
Oh, is it? Oh,
It's brackish now because of the flood.
I suppose, yeah.
But, yeah, that was the only time that we ever experienced flooding. But, you know, they opened the floods.
Did it recede very fast or?
Fairly fast because.
And I was telling my wife.
Yeah.
Look at that, and,
I said, if it gets to that tree, I'm gonna start freaking out. When we get to that tree, I go, okay, if it gets to that tree,
I bet.
I'm
so,
leaving.
look at that.
And then we get to that tree, like, okay, that tree.
I don't see any strange facilities
So it's
there.
not raining,
Well, you know, we don't
I've been
have a-
asking the city for many years to.
And, but you know.
They haven't done it, I mean, I think this is a really low part.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
that's just it.
Let me show you
Defenses
that.
like that are meant for worst cases.
Yeah, yeah, so there used to be a guy, Chuck Ross, that used to live
So
here.
yeah, definitely. What,
Look at my feet.
He was trying to get.
so what I would ask you is please send us those pictures as well as your address. That way we can include it into our analysis.
Because I saw a floating thing the other day on the app, and they didn't.
If that ends up being solutions.
Specifically, so every time I can, I just. tell the city.
That's important because they relay that information to us as well.
Perfect.
Awesome. What was your name?
Patricia Gonzalez.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.
Now,
Do you have anything else to present? Otherwise, I'll stop.
No, I'm just gonna leave the email address for anybody that would like to send comments to the village.
The recording has stopped.